Next, let's introduce the idea of block-level HTML elements, also known as paragraph-like elements. Block-level elements typically have a blank line above and below and are often allowed to contain other block-level elements. This is in contrast to what we'll look at later with inline elements that flow into the existing paragraph and are never allowed to contain block-level elements. Headings we'll look at first. Then we'll look at basic paragraphs. We'll look at tables in the next lecture. We'll look at forms in the next lecture, but both of those are block-level elements. We'll look at lists in this lecture, and eventually we'll look at a few other miscellaneous elements. Okay, now one of the things that we'll do when we cover these elements, these tags, is say what attributes does each of these tags have to control its either appearance or behavior. But there are a few attributes that are shared across the vast majority of HTML elements. In particular, ID. ID is an identifier, and in particular, it's a unique identifier. Only one element in the page is allowed to have an ID. There are two uses for an ID. The most common use is so that JavaScript, usually with jQuery, can find it. There's only one thing in the page with an ID, and so if you refer to an ID and jQuery looks for it, it finds either 0 or 1 matches. If jQuery looked for a paragraph or a heading, it might find lots of matches. But if it looked for a particular ID, it'll only find 1. And so if you have a button and you want to assign behavior to it, this is what will happen when the user clicks on it. You give it an ID, and then it's very easy to write jQuery code to assign the behavior. There's only one button with this ID. Now, we also saw earlier that you also can use an ID and make it a target of scrolling for internal hypertext links. That is used as well, but more common is so that JavaScript, in particular the jQuery JavaScript library, can refer to it later. Another really important attribute that's shared by the vast majority of HTML elements is class. Class refers to a style sheet name. Now, a style sheet name will have no effect unless you define it somehow in your page yourself. We'll see this in an upcoming lecture on CSS. It's not illegal to refer to a style sheet name that doesn't exist. Occasionally you do this in JavaScript just so you can find some groups of tags and operate on several tags at once, but more often it refers to an existing name. There are no built-in style sheet names in HTML. So if you say class equals warning, that means in your CSS file, you need to make a style sheet name called warning. And the point here is that this is the preferred way of doing styling. Rather than embedding font tags inside your paragraph or using explicit alignment, you say this CSS name controls the way this particular paragraph looks. This is a warning. And it kind of divorces the layout from the visual appearance. And so you can go later to your style sheet and say, you know, my warnings should be in red. And then later you say, no, I didn't want them in red. I wanted them to have a yellow background. Or I wanted them to be bigger. Or I wanted them to have a border around them. And so you can kind of decide later exactly how you want it to look. And the page author just says, this is where I put warnings. And the, page designer, who might not be the same person, can then attach a visual look to it. And so that's a very good way of doing things. We'll do this extensively when we get to the jQuery section, and we'll introduce the concept of kind of how to define those CSS styles in an upcoming lecture on CSS. Okay, so ID and class are shared by the vast majority of HTML elements, so I'm not going to repeat them when I cover each of the HTML elements. I'm going to look just at the one or two most important attributes that an element has that's specific to that tag. All right. Style. The most common way that you use CSS is you refer to a class name. And the class name is defined in the CSS file separately. But you can also, if you want to, kind of do a one-off. Here is the style right there. And what you put inside the style tag is the same kind of stuff you could have put in your CSS file. In the vast majority of cases, it's better to omit the style tag, in other words, don't put the styles in line, and use a CSS name so that it's more generalizable, so that you can repeat it on more than one HTML element and maybe even on more than one page whereas an inline style isn't shared by other places in the page. But if you have something that's not shared by other places in the page, there's nothing wrong with an inline style, but generally class from the previous page is preferred over style so that it's more reusable and repeatable. Okay, and then most HTML elements also let you supply JavaScript event handlers. Here's a very quick example, but we'll do this in a lot more detail when we get to jQuery. OnClick equals. So I have an input element. It's a button. And I say, when a user clicks on it, run this JavaScript code, call this function, do something cool. And so the button is in the page. You've loaded some JavaScript function definitions, but the functions haven't run yet. But then later when the user clicks on the button, then the JavaScript code runs, perhaps to go to the server, retrieve some data, and insert into the page.